My daughter-in-law hit me with a mop and screamed that I was nothing. My own son turned away. That night I left their house with bruises on my back and a suitcase in my hand. I used to build empires from smoke and ribs, but in their eyes I was just a burden. They thought I'd disappear quietly. But the thing about women like me, we've already walked through fire. ChatGPT Danoi. I used to wake up to the smell of smoked brisket and fresh cornbread. Now I wake up to the sound of my daughter-in-law's heels on tile and the silence that follows. My name is Virginia Eastwood. I'm 73 years old and I live in a house where my name is never spoken. Not with affection, not with memory, not with respect. They call it their house now, Brendan and Haley. But the down payment came from my retirement savings. The very kitchen where I once slow-roasted pork belly for 5 hours is now where I silently rinse dishes no one thanks me for washing. That morning, I sat at the end of the long oak table. The same table Brendan used to crawl under when he was 5, pretending to be a tiger. Now he sits across from me in crisp shirts and sharp silence. Haley, always perfectly put together, placed a plate of avocado toast in front of herself and barely looked up. She didn't bother asking if I had eaten. No one did. On the wall behind them, I used to hang photos. Me and Brendan standing in front of our first food truck. Brendan with barbecue sauce all over his face at the state fair. Me receiving an award for women entrepreneurs over 50. That wall is empty now. A sleek canvas print of Napa Valley hangs there instead. It doesn't smell like smoke or love. It smells like lavender-scented detachment. During dinner that night, Haley laughed at something on her phone. Brendan chuckled along. I said nothing. I had made cornbread, but no one touched it. Instead, Haley pushed her arugula salad around and asked Brendan what the marketing team thought about the new seasonal menu. I didn't ask to be the center of attention, but it's a strange feeling being invisible in a house you helped build. A stranger in a kitchen you once ruled like a queen. That night, I stood alone in the pantry. My hands touched the spice jars I had labeled 20 years ago. Paprika, garlic powder, ancho chili, the familiar worn caps felt like friends. I remembered the night Brendan helped me grind black pepper from whole pods for the brisket rub. He was 16 and had just told me he wanted to go to culinary school. I cried that night, proud. Now I cry in silence. I know I'm not the only one. Some of you listening, you know this ache. The one where love turns to tolerance. Where your place at the table becomes conditional. If you feel like you're quietly disappearing from your own family's story, then you're not alone. I didn't speak up that night, but something inside me stirred. The kind of stillness that comes before a storm. I wasn't angry yet, but I was starting to remember who I used to be. And believe me, once a woman like me starts remembering, things begin to change. The next weekend, Haley invited her co-workers and a few neighbors over for what she called a casual networking brunch. I stayed out of the way that morning, wiping down the counters and folding dish towels in the laundry room. I didn't want to linger, but part of me still hoped someone might ask for my help with the food. They didn't. Brendan came down in a polo shirt that looked new. He barely glanced at me before heading straight for the back patio to light the grill. I followed slowly, standing just inside the sliding doors out of the way. The guests began to arrive in waves. Women in muted florals, men in khakis and button-downs. Laughter floated in with the breeze. Haley floated too in a pale pink dress, barefoot with a glass of rosé in her hand. She looked like someone who had read a magazine about effortless entertaining and decided to perform it. She greeted each guest like royalty. Then she turned and pointed toward me. "This is Virginia," she said. She used to work at the old restaurant before we rebranded. Some of the guests smiled politely. One of the men raised his brows and asked if that meant I was a retired chef. Haley jumped in before I could speak. She was more like a behind-the-scenes type, kind of a family fixture. You know how it is. I smiled tight. I looked at Brendan standing by the grill flipping asparagus with the wrong side of the tongs. He didn't meet my eyes, he just reached for a beer. I slipped back inside, heart thudding low and heavy. I went to the hall closet to hang up a stray jacket one of the guests had left on a chair. As I closed the door, my eyes landed on the photo frames lining the hallway. There used to be a snapshot of me and Brendan from the grand opening of our first location. I wore a red bandana and had sauce on my apron. I remember that day so clearly. I cooked for 16 hours and still danced to blues with Brendan at closing time. Now the frame held a picture of Brendan and Haley on a ski trip in Aspen. All the other photos were of them too. I was gone. Not just missing, but erased. I went to my room, pulled open the drawer where I kept some of the old newspaper clippings and awards. I didn't take them out. I just looked at the edges of the papers peeking out from the folders. Part of me wanted to pin one on the fridge like a child, like I needed to remind them I had built something before them. But I didn't. I just shut the drawer and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sound of laughter drifting in from the backyard. Later that evening, Haley knocked once and walked in without waiting. She had a wine glass in one hand and a tablet in the other. "The event was a hit," she said, tapping on the screen. "Oh, and by the way, we're thinking about updating the Legacy Kitchen page to reflect the new direction. Brendan's working with a design firm." "You're fine with that, right?" I said nothing. She kept talking. "It's just cleaner that way. More professional. You'll still be mentioned, of course. Like, in the About section. Briefly." That word hit like cold water. Briefly. As if my 25 years of sweat, risk, and survival could be summed up in 2 lines under a stylized photo of a burger that didn't even exist when I was in charge. She left without waiting for a response. The door stayed open. I sat still for a long time after that. Something in me had hardened. I didn't cry, not that night. I just took out my old ledger and started flipping through it. It was full of handwritten recipes, margins, crowded with notes in ink and grease. But between the lines there were memories too. Staff birthdays, profit losses, lists of groceries and emergency contacts. Bits of real life no one else would ever care to notice. That was when I knew. I had been recast in my own story, from founder to footnote, from mother to employee, and no one had even asked for permission. That Wednesday, Brendan came home early. I could tell something was different because he didn't take off his shoes or stop by the kitchen for his usual handful of almonds. He walked straight to the dining table and laid out a manila folder like he was preparing for a meeting. I was chopping onions at the counter. The house smelled like beef stew and thyme. He didn't say hello. He just called my name like I was a nurse in a clinic. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and sat down across from him. He slid the folder toward me. "This is just clean-up paperwork," he said. "Mostly formality. It's about the Legacy brand. We're reorganizing under a new entity for efficiency." Haley's uncle helped draw it up. I didn't reach for it. I looked at him. His face was smooth rehearsed, like he'd already practiced this conversation in his head 100 times. Then Haley appeared in the doorway. She was holding her phone like she was texting someone, but glanced up just in time to catch my hesitation. She walked in and sat beside Brendan. No greeting, no smile. "We figured it's time to streamline things," she said. "Clean the slate, make sure everything's aligned with modern practices." I finally opened the folder. It wasn't a cleanup. It was a complete restructuring of ownership. All assets, intellectual property, licensing rights, and royalties were to be transferred to a new holding company under Brendan and Haley's names. There was a single clause referencing a one-time gratitude honorarium, which from the looks of it was less than the value of one quarterly check from my old franchise agreement. My name didn't appear anywhere in the executive roles. I was not even listed as a founder, just a historical figure noted as the brand's origin story in one sentence near the end. I flipped through each page slowly, my thumb pressing into the paper like I could squeeze out the truth. Brendan started to speak again, but Haley cut him off. "There's no pressure, Virginia, but it would really help with our expansion if we could finalize this soon. We're looking at 2 new locations in Austin and Seattle. Investors want to see clean ownership lines." Clean. That word again. I asked quietly why my name had been removed. Not out of anger, out of sheer curiosity. Haley answered with a shrug. Because legacy isn't just about the past. It's about who carries it forward. No offense, but people expect younger faces now. That's just branding. I didn't say a word. I closed the folder and stood up. "We'll revisit it later," I said. Brendan looked relieved. Haley looked annoyed. That night I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs after midnight and opened my laptop. I tried logging into the legacy business account. My access was denied. I tried again using my personal login. Still nothing. I called the bank the next morning. The representative told me I had been removed from the primary business account 3 weeks ago. Legally. With full documentation. Apparently Brendan had processed it using my old general power of attorney, which I had granted him years ago when he first joined the business. I had forgotten it even existed. I checked the company email. My old address bounced back. No longer active. When I pulled up the official Legacy Kitchen website, I saw a new team photo on the About page. Brendan stood in the center, Haley to his left. A few new chefs and staff flanked them. My name was nowhere. I scrolled to the menu section. None of the original recipes remained. No brisket sandwich named after my mother. No rosemary cornbread. No slow braised ribs with blackberry glaze. All gone. Even the tagline was new. Fresh fire. Modern flavor. I sat in the kitchen, phone still in hand, heart like ice in my chest. They had erased me, not just from the paperwork, from the story, from the brand, from the food. I looked down at my hands. They still bore faint burns from 1,000 hot pans and oven doors. My wrists still ached on rainy days from hauling trays and slicing onions for 20 years. My body remembered, even if they didn't. Later that week, Haley walked in with a draft contract printed in high-gloss color. She laid it on the kitchen table next to my cup of tea. "We thought maybe this version would feel more official," she said, then added with a smile, "Something worthy of your signature." I told her I'd consider it. But in truth, I already knew my answer, and I had already started thinking about how to make my next move count. Not with anger, not with noise, but with precision and with history. The first thing I noticed was the silence of my inbox. That morning I had poured myself a cup of coffee before dawn, as I always did, and sat down to check on the restaurant's weekly report. But my login didn't work. I tried again. Nothing. I reached out to the IT contact we'd used for years. He responded in a clipped message. "Access has been restricted as per management request." No name, no explanation. Just a wall where a door used to be. Still, I wasn't ready to believe. I went to the filing room in the back of the house where we kept archived hard copies. The key was gone. The cabinet had a new lock. I stood in front of it longer than I care to admit. I could hear Haley upstairs walking in heels, confident, in control. Later that afternoon, I drove to the main restaurant. I told myself I would act casual like any day. But the young hostess looked confused when she saw me. Her name tag read, Sophia. She barely hid her discomfort when she said, "We've updated our access procedures. You'll need to schedule a visit with management. I wasn't even angry. Not yet. Just foggy, like my name no longer belonged to anything. I walked past her anyway, ignoring the uncomfortable shuffle behind me, and stepped into the main floor. The place looked brighter, colder. There were new paintings on the wall, new slogans. I searched for the menu posted behind the bar. Gone was Eastwood's first fire-grilled brisket. Gone was Grandma Ginny's peach cobbler. Instead, I saw generic names. Smoked classic, rustic fruit bake. It was like someone had taken a red pen and erased me out of every dish, every corner. I turned to the bartender, a young man with tattoos on his arm. He looked startled when I asked for the menu. He handed me a fresh printout. No dish bore my touch, not even the sauce recipes I developed in the early 90s. It was all labeled House Blend. I felt something shift in my chest. Not heartbreak, not betrayal, extinction. I walked to the kitchen. I knew the back entrance codes, or I thought I did. They had changed. A staff member cracked the door open halfway and said he had to check with his supervisor before letting me in. That evening I went back home. I sat on the guest bed. My bed, the one across from the laundry room. A room that used to be the storage closet, now redone with a lamp and a floral quilt. I opened my laptop again this time, checking not the restaurant accounts, but my own business email. Disabled. I checked the official LLC registration of Eastwood & Coton. It had been updated. New signatures, Brendan's name, Haley's name, my own stripped, no forwarding contact, no formal removal notice, just gone. That's when I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the desk. They hadn't just taken the business. They had removed me from memory. Legally, quietly, completely. The next morning I visited the courthouse. I requested a copy of the company's public filings. The clerk looked at me over her glasses and asked, "Are you authorized to retrieve these?" I gave my name. She hesitated, then went to the back room. When she returned, she handed me a packet. On top, a post-it note was attached. It read, "Transferred majority rights per internal agreement. Effective 10 weeks ago. 10 weeks. I had still been making Sunday brisket, still been stocking shelves, still been printing payroll checks, all while my name had already been deleted. I left the courthouse. My knees were stiff. My hands trembled only slightly, but enough that I needed to pause on the bench outside. For a long time I stared ahead at the courthouse steps. People came and went. Some smiled, some argued. Life moved on. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out my old recipe book, the one with oil stains and margin notes, my handwriting fading at the edges. There on the inside flap was the phrase I'd written back in 1984. Flavor is memory. Name is soul. I closed it and held it to my chest. They had taken both. But not forever. The wind howled through the gaps in the old window frames that night, rattling like it was trying to warn me. I had always loved winter storms when I was younger. They reminded me of strength of survival. But that night, the cold felt different. It pressed in from the outside and mirrored the quiet that had crept into the walls of my son's house. Haley had decided to host a staff dinner for the core restaurant team at the house. She called it a tradition. I didn't remember it being one, but I had learned to stop questioning things out loud. She prepared everything with flair, wearing her cream-colored blouse and gold earrings, orchestrating each detail like a performance. Brendan helped set the table but barely said a word to me. He kept his eyes down his shoulders, tense. I watched him place each fork perfectly aligned, like he was trying to straighten something far messier than silverware. I made my usual sweet potato casserole. No one asked me to, but I couldn't stand sitting around doing nothing while strangers chopped vegetables in the kitchen that used to be mine. I layered cinnamon and brown sugar on top, crushed pecans with the back of a spoon, and baked it until the top bubbled golden. I set it on the edge of the dining table without a word. When everyone gathered, Haley stood at the head. Brendan sat on her right, and I was placed on the far end near the pantry door. As the team talked and laughed, I listened in silence. The conversation turned to rebranding expansion newer menus. A young woman named Danielle mentioned something about revamping the winter specials. Haley raised her wine glass and said with a gleam in her eye, "We've come so far from the old comfort food. We're aiming for modern palates now." It's time the restaurant grew out of its dusty roots. Some people chuckled, others nodded politely. She tilted her head slightly toward my end of the table and added, "That includes letting go of sentimental dishes that don't reflect where we're going." The words floated in the air like frost. My casserole sat untouched steam, curling upward like it was still hoping to be chosen. Brendan kept his gaze low, cutting his meat slowly. His fork trembled a little. I waited for someone to acknowledge the insult tucked beneath Haley's toast. No one did. I folded my napkin. My hands were steady. My stomach churned, but I kept my voice calm. After the plates had been cleared and the guests had migrated toward dessert and more wine, I excused myself. I climbed the stairs quietly and entered my room. The lamp on the nightstand cast a soft yellow glow across the room. I sat down at the small desk and pulled out the worn brown notebook I had kept since the early days of the food truck. I opened it to the back section where the pages weren't recipes or plans, but memories. I had started documenting everything the moment I first noticed Haley rewriting the business language. Each entry had a date, a location, and a single sentence. February 3rd, Haley introduced me to a vendor as just Brendan's mum. March 17th, my brisket recipe was renamed Chef's Choice on the menu. April 12th, Brendan asked me to stop attending team meetings, said it confused the staff. August 28th, my office at the downtown location had been emptied. No explanation. And now? November 14th, called sentimental baggage at dinner in my own house. I stared at that sentence for a long time before I wrote the next one. Tonight I remembered my name. I wrote it down slowly, pressing hard with the pen. Not just the name printed on old company documents, but the name that mattered. Virginia Eastwood, founder, builder. Woman who carried 2 toddlers on her back while flipping ribs over open flame. The name that had value before contracts, before logos, before anyone needed to sign anything to know who she was. The house was quiet again. I could hear Haley laughing downstairs, probably over wine. Brendan was silent as always. I didn't know what he was becoming, but I knew who I had been, and who I still was. I flipped the page and started writing something new. It wasn't a record this time. It was an outline, a strategy. I made a list of everything that had been taken. Then beside it, I made another list. One of everything they hadn't touched. The things they didn't even know I had kept copies of. Trademark filings, original branding documents, recipes handwritten in my father's pen. Every version of the LLC articles from the day we incorporated. And something else. A letter Geraldine had helped me draft years ago after my second restaurant had been forced into a buyout. Back then, she said, "Always have a backup for the day they forget who bled for this." I smiled, not because I felt victorious, but because I finally felt awake. That night, I lit a candle on my nightstand. I placed my notebook beside it and stared at the flame for a long while. It flickered against the window pane, reflecting a woman they could not erase. The morning after the staff dinner was oddly bright. Sunlight poured through the frosted kitchen windows, painting long strips of gold across the floor. I stood at the counter pouring myself a cup of coffee. No one else was awake yet. But the peace didn't last. By noon, Haley was already stomping around the house, heels sharp on the wood floors. She held a folder thick with documents, and her eyes were thin slits of rehearsed patience. Brendan trailed behind her like a man who had once known how to speak, but forgot along the way. She dropped the folder on the kitchen table with a thud. The clatter made the silverware tremble in the drawer. "This is the final version," she said flatly. "Clean. Updated. With protections for everyone." She didn't look at me when she said it, but her voice had that edge like she was daring me to argue. Brendan pulled out a chair, gesturing for me to sit. I stayed standing. I flipped through the pages slowly. Each clause was more cutting than the last. Transfer of remaining intellectual property, release of claim to any future equity, assignment of all real estate assets currently under dispute. In short, it was the final severing, legally and personally. She circled behind me, arms crossed, tapping her fingers on her sleeve. I could feel the tension coil tighter with each second I stayed silent. "This ensures the transition runs smoothly," she added. I looked up, my voice low. "And what transition would that be?" She scoffed. "You stepping down? You retiring gracefully? You no longer haunting the margins of the company like a bad memory?" Her words weren't heated. They were cold, practiced, the kind that bruised without raising a voice. I placed the folder back on the table. "No." Haley blinked. "Just once." Then something cracked in her face. Her mouth tightened, her chin lifted. She moved so fast I barely had time to react. She reached into the corner by the pantry where the mop sat drying. She grabbed the handle like it was a sword and slammed it against my back. Hard. The sound echoed off the tile. The first hit didn't floor me, but it stunned me enough to stumble forward. I grabbed the edge of the table. She hit again, this time across my shoulder. "What are you doing?" Brendan said, not loud, not angry, just numb. She didn't answer. She raised the mop a third time, but it slipped from her grip and clattered to the floor. Her face was red, her chest heaved. "You don't get to say no," she hissed. "Not anymore." I didn't speak. I didn't cry out. I picked up the mop, not to return it, just to remove it from the floor. I leaned it gently against the wall. Brendan still hadn't moved. His hand was halfway to his phone, but he didn't dial. He looked away when I met his eyes. I stepped back, adjusted my cardigan, and turned toward the stairs. She called after me, her voice cracking. "You think walking away makes you right?" I didn't turn around. I walked up slowly, counting the steps. My joints ached from the blows. But it wasn't the pain that got to me. It was the memory. I had taken harder hits in life, but never from inside my own home. When I reached my room, I sat on the bed without touching the bruises. I opened my notebook again, wrote one clean sentence. December 3rd. She raised a mop like it was a weapon, and Brendan watched. I stared at those words until they stopped shaking on the page, until they became just ink. Downstairs, I heard the soft sound of a drawer slamming shut. Later that evening, I passed Brendan in the hallway. He didn't say anything. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and kept walking. But before he vanished into his room, he left something on the hallway table. It was a photograph. Old, faded, but unmistakable. The food truck's opening day. Brendan no more than 10, holding a spatula like it was a trophy. Me behind him, flour on my cheek, smiling like I owned the whole sky. No note. Just that photo. I didn't touch it. I left it right where he placed it. That night, I didn't light a candle. I turned off every light in my room, closed the curtains tight, and laid still in the dark. Some storms come without thunder. but you still feel them pass through you. Tomorrow I would pack the final box. But tonight I remembered violence wasn't just what was done to you. Sometimes it was what others let happen. The morning after the mop handle incident, I left the house before the sun finished rising. I didn't take a suitcase, just a canvas tote with a folder inside. The notebook stayed zipped in the front pocket. My shoulders still throbbed, but the ache felt distant now. There was something colder in me that had finally settled. I drove myself across town in silence past the old industrial park and the forgotten side of East Richmond. Most of it had changed, but one corner remained exactly the same. The green awning over the storefront, the chipped wooden sign, Shaw and Boyd, attorneys at law. I knocked twice, then walked in. The bell above the door let out the same tinny chime it always had. She hadn't changed much. Geraldine Shaw still wore her grey suits, like armour, her hair tucked in that tight bun that said she didn't waste time on pleasantries. She didn't smile when she saw me, just nodded once, then motioned to the seat across her desk. I sat. Neither of us said anything for a long time. Then she opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a thick leather binder. "Been waiting for you," she said simply. I blinked. "You knew I'd come back." She looked at me like that was the stupidest thing I'd ever said. We both leaned over the desk. I opened the binder. Inside were copies of every agreement I had ever signed when I founded the Fork and Flame. Trademarks, licenses, menu, copyrights. Even the operating agreement from the first pop-up stand Brendan helped me run. I never shredded anything she said, just in case they forgot whose name built that brand. I turned the pages. The ink was faded in some, but every line was legible. Everything that mattered had my name on it. Not Brendan's, not Hayley's. I closed the binder. "I want to dissolve it," I said. "All of it. The brand. The legal entity. I want to strip it clean. Start again." Geraldine didn't flinch. She only leaned back, tapping a pen against her desk. "We can. It'll take some work, but it's all here. You never fully transferred control. They've been operating off assumptions and informal power plays, not law." I nodded slowly. The weight of that truth sank deep. I hadn't just been erased. I'd allowed them to do it quietly, assuming no one would notice. And now I had the proof, the power, and the right. "What do you want to do with the assets?" she asked. That's when I told her about the idea, about the notebook I'd been keeping, about the dozens of women I'd met over the years, cooks, servers, managers, women who aged out of the system, who got pushed aside for being too slow, too old, too outspoken. The same ones who taught the next generation how to chop onions, balance a till talk down a belligerent customer, and then got shown the door with a gift card and a polite thank you. "I want to turn it into a fund," I said, "a non-profit. For women over 50 who've been pushed out, silenced or betrayed, especially by the people they once lifted up." Geraldine's eyes lit with something sharp. "Good," she said. "That's justice, not vengeance." We spent the rest of the morning mapping it out, line by line. I transferred rights to the original logos and naming conventions. We refiled the corporation under a different name. She called a contact at the state office. I made a list of dishes I wanted to give away. Old recipes, signatures, not just menus, but memories. By noon, the paper trail had changed direction. I was no longer the founder of the Fork and Flame. I was the director of the Hearthlight Foundation. It felt like exhaling after years underwater. Before I left, Geraldine pulled one last folder from her cabinet. "There's something else," she said. "They've been quietly listing your house as a future business asset, tied it into the holding company through a shell clause in the updated bylaws. But they never recorded it properly, which means—" "It's mine," I said. She nodded. "For now," she added. "But you should move quickly. They're not playing with rules anymore. I stood up, looked around her small office. It hadn't changed since the first time I came here with flour on my apron and dreams in my pockets. Thank you, Geraldine. She waved it off. You're the one who cooked for 300 union workers in 90-degree heat. This is the easy part. I stepped outside. The wind was picking up. The sky was pale but not empty. I had come in a bruised woman. I walked out as someone they should have never underestimated. We didn't waste time. By the following Monday, Geraldine and I were back in her office sifting through old contracts and dissolving the corporate framework piece by piece. The Fork and Flame as a legal entity began its slow, deliberate undoing. It didn't feel sad. It felt clean, like pulling weeds after a long storm. Some roots were deep, others came loose with a quiet tug. The business I had built with my own hands was never about glossy branding or modern fusion trends. It was about comfort, dignity, something that filled a belly and reminded you who you were. Geraldine filed the articles for voluntary dissolution. I signed every page. Every signature erased a line Brendan and Haley thought they had control over. But I wasn't doing this for revenge. I wasn't even doing it for Brendan anymore. I was doing it for women like me, who had poured themselves into something only to be forgotten once they were no longer useful. We called the new entity the Hearthlight Foundation. The name came from a line I scribbled years ago in the back of my recipe journal. It read, "Home isn't a roof. It's the hand that remembers how to season a pot, even when it shakes." Geraldine thought that was the heart of it, and I agreed. By the end of the week, the paperwork was filed. The assets from my dissolved business, trademarks, original menu items, archived photos, even the old name, were donated to the foundation. Geraldine brought in a third-party firm to oversee the financial transitions to keep things clean and irreversible. We worked late that Friday. Her office lights glowed while the rest of the street went dark. She spread out the final drafts on her desk. One section detailed the mission. It was clear and unpolished, just how I liked it. To support women aged 50 and over who've experienced personal or professional betrayal. To provide retraining, emotional support, legal resources, and above all, dignity. Through food, through work, through community. I signed that page last. The next morning we met at the old warehouse where I used to hold community cookouts. It had sat unused for a few years, but the bones were still solid. Rusted metal, sure, but the kind that holds stories in it. Geraldine knew someone who could help with permitting and renovations. The foundation would use it as a gathering space, a learning kitchen, a small pantry stocked from local gardens. Nothing fancy, nothing loud. We painted the front door a dusty red. I hung the first photo on the wall, a black and white shot of me and my friend Reba, taken in 1974. Both of us in aprons, both of us laughing. I didn't frame it. I used clothespins on twine. It felt more honest that way. In the days that followed, we met with 3 other women who wanted to volunteer. One had run a diner in North Carolina. One had managed a hotel kitchen in Arizona before her son replaced her with a younger chef. Another had taught culinary classes at a community college for 20 years before being told her methods were outdated. Their stories were different, but the wound was familiar. One night I stayed late at the space. It was quiet. I sat at the butcher block table and pulled out my old notebook, the one with the worn leather spine and ink-stained corners. Every page had a name, a moment, a dish. Some of those names belonged to women I hadn't seen in decades. Some were already gone. But their hands had shaped mine. Their stories deserved a second chapter. I copied out a list from the back of the notebook and tacked it to the corkboard. At the top, I wrote who we're doing this for. Below were names, just first names: Agnes, Ruth, Dolores, Martha, Bernadine. I didn't add my own. That would come later once I had earned the right to stand beside them again. Geraldine walked in, holding 2 mugs of coffee. We didn't speak much. She just handed me mine, then looked at the list. "You think they'll see it?" she asked after a while. I looked around the space. It was still bare, still echoing with old dust. But in the quiet, I could almost hear laughter again. Pans clinking, aprons swaying. "They will," I said, "not with their eyes, but in the hands we reach, in the meals we serve." We sat there for a while, just 2 old women who refused to fade away quietly. Later that night, I added one more thing to the wall. A printed plaque made from a slice of reclaimed wood. It read, "From the hands that built to the hands still building." That was our legacy now. Not a restaurant, not a brand, but a flame passed forward. And for the first time in a long while, I felt warm again. The morning of the press conference, I woke up early. Not out of nerves, but out of instinct. Years of running kitchens had trained my body to rise before the world. I brewed a pot of coffee, not strong, just warm enough to calm my thoughts. Then I stepped out onto the back porch of my little rented duplex and watched the morning take its time with the light. By 9 a.m., the headlines had already started appearing. They came in slow at first. Then the story caught fire. Virginia Eastwood walks away from the fork and flame, establishes non-profit for betrayed women over 50. Culinary matriarch transfers, entire business legacy to foundation smoked out. Eastwood leaves Haley Brennan's rebrand in ashes. Geraldine had called a trusted journalist she knew from the Des Moines Journal, a woman named Lila. She had been covering community rebuilding stories for over a decade. She didn't like gossip. She liked truth, and she told it well. Lila's piece dropped first. It was simple fact-checked and piercing in its restraint. She didn't use any flowery adjectives. She just laid out the timeline. From the founding of the restaurant to the moment I was erased from company records to the formation of the Hearthlight Foundation. There was a quote from me at the end. I remembered the phone call when I gave it. They took my name off a menu, so I built a new table. By 10 a.m., Brendan and Haley were already at the podium inside that shiny new event space they had leased for the big rebrand. They had planned this day for weeks, hired a PR firm, sent out curated gift boxes to influencers and food bloggers. Everyone was supposed to be celebrating the new vision, the new menu, the new legacy. But the air in the room was tight. In the photos that went online, you could see it. Brendan's smile didn't reach his eyes. Haley looked like someone had unplugged her right before the cameras rolled. Behind them, the screen still read "The Fork and Flame 2.0 in bold metallic script. But in the crowd, phones buzzed, heads turned. Lila's article was spreading. By the time Haley launched into her opening remarks, 2 reporters in the front row had already left their seats. One headline updated live during her speech: "Eastwood cuts ties, no ownership in new brand." A video went up not long after. It was from a woman in the crowd who had streamed the moment Brendan was asked whether his mother would be involved in the next phase. He paused. You could hear the silence stretch. He finally said, "She gave us her blessing." That lie didn't even last an hour. By noon, a second article dropped with photos from our warehouse site. Geraldine and I had posed beside the painted red door. Behind us, the chalkboard sign read, "The Hearthlight Foundation, opening soon." I didn't wear anything special, just my old denim apron, the same one I wore in the photo of me and Reba. The apron with the burnt patch near the front pocket. That detail made it into the caption. The comment section started to flood. Some people defended Brendan, said families are complicated, others weren't as kind. They called Haley opportunistic, called the rebrand hollow. But I didn't read too many of them. I knew what those headlines could do to a heart, and mine had already been tested enough. That evening, Geraldine and I returned to the foundation space. We didn't talk much. She handed me a copy of Midwest Kitchen and Craft. They had picked up the story for their upcoming print issue. On the last page was a small section titled Recipes Reclaimed. Under it was one of mine: molasses cornbread with toasted oats. It ended with a note: a dish that doesn't need a restaurant to matter, just a memory and a little heat. We sat for a while in the soft light. The old smoker out back still smelled faintly of mesquite. A few of the women who had joined us earlier in the week trickled in. One brought a batch of scones. Another brought her granddaughter who wanted to volunteer. The world didn't shake, nothing exploded, but the ground had shifted. At sunset, I stepped outside and stood by the smoker. I lit a match and let it catch on the kindling. The smoke curled slow and steady into the fading sky. Behind me, the red door stood open. The light inside glowed golden, not grand, not glossy, but real. That was the day my name became more than a brand. It became a beacon. 2 days after the headlines calmed down, I came home from the foundation to find a thick envelope waiting on my porch. No return address, just my name handwritten across the front. No stamps either. It must have been hand-delivered. I turned it over in my hands, cautious vehiste. Not out of fear, but curiosity. Inside was a folded letter, the kind written on lined yellow paper with careful pressure. Tucked into the crease was a photo. It showed an older woman standing behind a food truck, her hands resting on the counter like she'd been there 100 times before. Her apron had flour smudges, her eyes tired but proud. I unfolded the letter and began to read. Dear Ms. Eastwood, I hope you don't mind me writing. My name is Alma Delaney. I live in Waco, Texas. I read about you in the journal and then again in Midwest Kitchen and Craft. My daughter mailed me the article clipped right from the paper. She said, Mama, you need to see this. I've never written anyone like this before, not in my 68 years. But something about your story stuck to me. It rattled loose a memory I had packed away like a broken pan you don't want to throw out, even if it doesn't work anymore. I used to run a little diner, Alma's Table, opened it with my husband in '82. We did breakfast and pies mostly. Real simple. Biscuits from scratch coffee brewed strong. That place paid for braces, prom dresses, and one bad Chevy we never should have bought. We worked every day but Christmas, and we were proud of what we built. But 10 years ago, my son married a woman named Gina. She was sharp and ambitious and had big ideas for the place. She said she'd take care of us and keep it in the family. Said all the right thing until the papers were signed. Then everything changed. My husband got sick. I had to step away for a while. When I came back, the locks were changed and the name had been scrubbed off the window. She renamed it Gina's Grill, changed the menu, kept my cinnamon roll recipe, but started calling them Texas Twists. I asked about my table, the one my husband built by hand. She said it had termites and had to go. I later found it out back, broken in half, left by the dumpsters. I never got my name back. Never got to serve one last breakfast. For a while I thought maybe I deserved it, that I hadn't been strong enough to protect what I built, that maybe women like us were only meant to start things, not finish them. But then I read about you, about how you didn't just walk away, you redirected the whole river. You made something new from the ruins. And it wasn't out of spite. It was out of belief. That stirred something in me. So here's what I'm doing. Next month, I'm pulling my old camper out of the shed. The tires are shot and the roof leaks, but the griddle still works. My granddaughter says she'll help me repaint it. We're going to call it Alma's again. Just breakfast 3 days a week, nothing fancy. But this time it'll be on my terms. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted you to know that you lit something I thought had gone out. and I figured you ought to hear that from someone who knows how heavy a spatula can feel after 40 years. Thank you, not just for the idea, but for the proof. With respect, Alma, I sat with the letter for a long while. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, tracing lines on the floor, like soft reminders that time keeps moving whether we notice or not. I looked at the photo again. Alma's hands told the story, worn, strong, the kind of hands that never stopped feeding people, even when no one remembered to thank her. I pinned the letter on the corkboard in my office at the foundation, right next to the first blueprint for the hearthlight space. Then I placed the photo inside the drawer with my recipe cards. It belonged there. I didn't cry, not then, but I felt something loosen in my chest, like a pressure I hadn't known I was holding. The next morning I wrote back. Just a short note, no flourish, told her the name Alma's again was perfect, told her to keep the cinnamon rolls exactly the way she liked them, and that if she ever needed someone to test her coffee, I was only a state away. That letter reminded me what this had all been for. Not just about legacy or reputation, it was about voice, about reaching the women who thought their chapter had ended without a final sentence. Turns out, all some of us need is proof that the pen is still in our hand. The knock came just after 6 in the evening. No call ahead, no message, just the sound of knuckles against the wood, soft but certain. I opened the door, and there stood Brendan. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His collar was wrinkled, his eyes sunken and raw. He held something in his hand but kept it behind his back. We stood facing each other for a long, quiet moment. Then I stepped aside. He walked in slow and heavy, like his shoes were made of stone. He didn't sit. Just stood near the window, hands clenched, staring out as if he didn't recognize the trees anymore. He finally spoke. His voice had dropped, no longer clipped or defensive, but hoarse and low. He said he had seen the paper, said he read every word of the interview, that people had begun asking him questions, that some clients had pulled out of pre-scheduled events at the new location. I listened. I didn't nod. I didn't flinch. I simply let the weight of his words settle in the room like smoke. He said he never expected things to go this way, that he thought I would retire quietly, maybe move to a smaller place, maybe fade into a life of gardening and walks around the block, that the silence I carried all those years made him believe I would keep carrying it, even when it became too heavy. I sat down, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to be grounded. I looked at him and told him I had heard everything he didn't say all these years. Every time he looked away, every time he let Haley interrupt or override, every time he watched me being diminished and chose not to speak. Brendan didn't argue. He didn't defend Haley either. For once, he didn't try to protect anyone. He finally pulled the item from behind his back. It was an old photograph, worn around the edges, color fading. It was the two of us standing in front of our very first food truck. I was holding the first order slip, beaming. He was about 12 then, holding up a spatula like a trophy. I hadn't seen that photo in years. He placed it on the table in front of me. He said he found it while going through the storage box I had asked him to move years ago. Said he didn't know why he brought it today, only that it felt right. I looked at the photo and felt the old ache that comes when you remember joy as clearly as grief. I told him that for a long time I believed he carried forward my legacy, that I thought I had passed him something meaningful, something sacred. But the truth was, he had allowed someone else to reshape that legacy, strip it of its roots and name it something new. And in doing so, he didn't just silence me, he lost part of himself too. Brendan sat down, finally, across from me. His voice cracked when he admitted that he had been afraid, that he wasn't sure how to be both a son and a businessman. that Haley made decisions fast and fiercely, and he let her lead because it was easier than confronting the past. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. When he finished, I said one sentence. Not out of anger, not out of triumph. I said, "You chose Haley. I chose myself." He nodded. It was a small, broken nod, the kind that knows there's no fixing what has been done, only accepting it. We sat in silence after that, a quiet that didn't need to be filled. He stood to leave and asked if he could take the photo with him. I told him no. That photo was my memory too. He nodded again, this time slower. At the door, he looked back once. His mouth opened slightly like he might say something, but then he didn't. He just stepped outside and closed the door behind him. I stood there alone in the living room for a while, holding the photo. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a clearing, like something had moved aside, making room for what was next. The past had spoken, and it had finally been heard. The sun had already begun its descent when I lit the smoker. Old Faithful, I called it. The very first piece of equipment I bought on my own, long before there was a restaurant, long before Brendan knew how to lace his sneakers. I kept it all these years through every expansion, every renovation, every rebranding. It sat quietly in the corner of my garage, waiting for this day. We set up in the backyard. Geraldine arrived first, carrying her favorite picnic chair and a tin of homemade cornbread. She placed it on the long wooden table and gave me a look that needed no translation. I nodded. We were both exactly where we needed to be. Then came Linda, who ran the front desk at our old diner for 15 years before her divorce left her scrambling, and Cynthia, who used to manage kitchen logistics until cancer took her husband and the industry took her joy. They had been through their own versions of being discarded, and now, with the help of the foundation, they were rebuilding from the ground up. They didn't come out of pity. They came because they understood what it meant to reclaim something. The firewood hissed as I closed the lid on the ribs. The scent rose and curled in the air, earthy and slow, the kind of smell that tells a story before anyone speaks. No one said much at first. We set the table, uncorked a few bottles of cheap red wine, and turned on the old radio. I played a mix of bluegrass and classic country, the kind I used to hum when working prep late into the night. When the ribs were done, I sliced and served them myself. No menu, no price tag, no names attached. Just food, honest and hot, shared among women who had tasted betrayal and kept going anyway. We ate slowly, taking our time. There was no rush. The air carried that thick summer quiet where time feels suspended. I looked around the table and felt a peace I hadn't known in years, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was true. I had tried to hand over a legacy. Instead, I built a new one, not with plaques or framed menus, but with lives that still had fire in them, with stories that refused to be erased. As the sky deepened to violet, we lit a few candles. I watched the flicker reflect in the glasses in the lines of their faces. No one asked for forgiveness. No one begged for understanding. We had all stopped waiting for permission to exist. Old Faithful crackled behind us, the wood inside still glowing red. I stood up and walked over, added one more log, and let the smoke rise again. Some things don't need names printed on a menu to be remembered. Some things are passed on through taste, through warmth, through a woman quietly choosing to light the fire again. If this story stirred something in you, I invite you to sit with it a little longer. Maybe you've lived through your own silent erasure. Maybe you're still finding the words. Let this be your reminder you don't need permission to reclaim your story. You don't need a title or a plaque to know your worth. And if you ever feel forgotten, know that somewhere someone is lighting a fire that remembers exactly who you are. Follow our channel for more stories of strength, resilience, and quiet triumphs. Your voice matters. Your story counts. You are not alone.